Hi everybody! Hi Noga!
Hi, Gil.
Welcome back. Long time no see. And today we want to talk about Stranger Things. Oof.
Yay!
The hit Netflix nostalgia 80s Goonies like TV show. We're going back in time to a time where everything was wonderful and colorful.
What's the matter? You some kind of girl or something?
And this raises the question, why is this show so successful and so popular right now? What's the secret ingredient that makes everybody tune in? I don't think it's the story or the characters. I think it's the nostalgic parts. It's like we want to feel forever young.
Yeah, I mean, Stranger Things is, the nostalgia of our generation, right? I mean, it's people...
Thank you for saying that. We have a shared generation.
We share the generation. And people who are in their late 30s, in their 40s,
Yeah.
they suddenly have a place. I mean, they've become, more and more powerful in the media,
Right.
and they can start being nostalgic. And
Right.
of course, it's been a while, so we can be nostalgic when we look back at the 80s.
The answer to a never-ending story.
It would be harder to be nostalgic than it is now because we didn't have all these references, so you needed to take all these different roads. Now we don't need roads. The story is about all these teenagers. First of all was the boys, now it's a mixed group, super geeks. Back when being a geek or a nerd wasn't that cool.
So we look back at the 80s now in a positive way. I mean, I think it's funny because, I mean, culturally, the 80s weren't considered to be a very fruitful decade.
Nope.
Everything seemed a bit ridiculous in a sense later.
Right. And not a long time later, right when it was over, it was like,
What the fuck happened here? Yeah. What were we thinking? So
yeah, now it's like inconceivable.
inconceivable, but funny, in a funny way. Nostalgia is basically looking at things in retrospect, but seeing them in a very idealized way.
Dream a dream, and what you see will be.
We derive some sense of pleasure from looking back at the time, I mean, if we take, for example, Mad Men or some other movie that, takes place in a different period,
That is not nostalgic at all.
it is not nostalgic.
So they're worried that legs are gonna spread all over the world? That wouldn't bother me at all.
I mean, not for us. I mean, maybe, for people.
And warm them up first. Send a basket of pears to Marshall Fields. The one thing Dan likes is a nice pear.
This guy.
When we look back at it, we look back at like, so that's the way things were back then. I mean,
Cringe a lot.
you cringe a lot, and you say, "Oh, wow, that's so weird." I mean, it's like fun. It's interesting in this like weird way of seeing how people used to live.
The answer to a never-ending story.
But when we look back at the 80s, it's like you get a sense of belonging, a sense of familiarity. It's kind of like a warm feeling inside. It's fun in that sense.
And it's interesting because even though these 80s, they were not our 80s. So I was raised partly here, partly in Athens in Belgium. You were raised here. These were not our 80s.
In Israel.
In Israel, sorry. The 80s in Israel were very, very, very different. We didn't have malls. We only had malls like in the mid-90s. But still, it pushes the same nostalgic buttons for an imagined past, which is kind of what nostalgia is. You just ignore the fact that these four boys, I would assume that their lives back then wasn't as fun as it is now. A lot of them were lonely, didn't have all these friends, maybe were bullied.
What are you babbling about?
Well, what I'd said was I'm in the math club, the Latin club, and the physics club.
No, killing yourself is not an option.
Well, I didn't do it, did I? No, I don't think so.
Didn't have success with girls, contrast to what they did, to what we see in the show. I'm sure most of the girls back then just said no. So like now all the fantasy elements, fantasy genre, and all the role playing and all that. Back then you were playing in your basement D&D and nobody wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
Now it's like, yay, D&D, wow, now being nerdy is cool.
Yeah,
so now you can go back and change a little bit. It's not too aggressive in a way that you don't recognize the era. There's still misogyny and all that. But it's still in a way that is like you can handle it. You can handle it.
Right.
If you would look at these boys back then, I would say, yeah, I pity the fools.
I mean, it's funny when you say I pity the fools. I mean, you said before that even though we were living here, we still feel a sense of familiarity, even though our 80s looked very different than the 80s of those kids. But I think it is because we also watched the movies back then. I mean, and we were exposed to the clothing and the other parts of the culture through the movies. I mean, it was very different here because it wasn't as capitalist as it was in the US yet. So basically, nostalgia enables us to have some kind of a linear perception of our own development throughout the decades. I mean, when we see those cultural symbols, then we remember also ourselves at that age, you know, wanting to play Game Boy and Atari and whatever.
Can we please play D&D now?
No!
So we get like a sense of who we were back then. I mean, through those symbols, through those icons, we get back in touch to the people we were back then, to the kids we were back then.
Okay, why is that helpful?
In our memory, we need all kinds of triggers to trigger our memory to certain aspects. I mean, we have, you know, the sense of smell is a very strong trigger in that sense. Sometimes we smell something and then immediately we go back to a certain period. But also, I mean, just like the artifacts themselves, like the things that the objects we used to play with, they're also part of our memory. I mean, they trigger it and we get a sense of like consistency. I mean, some kind of a linearity, basically. And then it helps our sense of identity.
Help! Hey!
I mean, I have a patient, and he collects sentiments.
How can you collect sentiments?
Things with sentimental value, like objects with sentimental value.
So like holds them and say hello to my little friend? That's what he does?
He finds it difficult to say goodbye to his, elementary school notebooks, and all kinds of different games that he used to play and different things that he used to sketch in. And, you know, it's accumulating, it's adding up. So it's
like a hoarder.
It's not really hoarding because hoarders are collectors hoarders, you know. I mean, hoarders, they hoard all kinds of things because they say maybe they'll use them. He knows that he won't use them. And it's not that he has difficulty throwing away just any stuff. He has difficulty throwing away his, like, the parts of himself that were in the past. And in a way, I mean, it's like a difficulty to feel this kind of linearity and consistency and wholeness without the material object. I mean, it's like in a way...
He's a material boy.
He's a material boy.
No?
We can go where we want to, place where they will never find.
Okay, what about...
No, just to finish that idea.
As you wish.
Thank you.
רציתי לדעת איך אני אכניס את זה.
And so for him, it's like the breadcrumbs in the snow that Hansel and Gretel live when they leave the house. But it's like they leave it there in order to be able to come back. And for him, it serves the same purpose. But we can have that without the material objects. I mean, we have...
Like you said to the 80s, like, I'll be back. Going. If my calculations are correct,
It's getting very stale.
Okay, so I think nostalgia is not always like touchy, feely, fuzzy. You have also negative nostalgia. It could be like a tool.
In the good old days, you used to treat them very, very rough.
You can weaponize it politically. If you just like harken back to the days.
They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks.
Wish we could turn back time to the good old days when the mama sang us to sleep, but now we're stressed out.
In the good old days, they'd rip him out of that seat so fast.
Let's play Master and Servants. Let's play Master and Servants.
Where men were men, women were women, LGBTQs were far away in the closet.
Were still considered a psychiatric illness.
Right, so like you didn't have people who were different and were challenging the way that you wanted to live your life. If you saw somebody different, then that was like a problem. So now you have people who weaponize it for political purposes and just saying, all these people, send them back, send them away. It depends if you use it for good or for evil. And Stranger Things uses it for good, even though they have a lot of capitalist propaganda there. It's delivered in such a way.
It's a free market system, which means people get paid for their services depending on how valuable their contributions are. And this seems...
Man, this is some bullshit!
The mall, and they have the communists over there, and they have the fair and the 4th of July, and it's all like super cheesy. Nostalgia is not new, right? We didn't start the fire, it was always burning.
Right.
Since the world was turning.
I mean, you have the personal nostalgia, of course, and you have also like the cultural or the generational nostalgia. The term was coined in the 17th century by a medical student to describe the anxieties displayed by Swiss mercenaries fighting away from home.
Being nostalgic
Yeah.
to go back home.
So he described it as a kind of melancholy.
Changed since.
It depends, I guess, because some people, they look at it and they feel, I mean, they're nostalgic and they feel really great about it. You know, it's like this, this kind of like warm feeling.
If I could turn back time.
Yeah, it was so fun back then. Remember when we had that and we did this and that. When you have a traumatic event which splits your life to before and after, it's not integrated. Like, I mean, you say before the accident, before that happened to me, everything was great, and it's completely idealized. Like, it's completely split. Everything was terrific. I was completely functioning. I had everything going for me.
What did you think, really? That we were never gonna get girlfriends? That we were just gonna sit in my basement all day and play games for the rest of our lives? Yeah. I guess I did. I really did.
People are also nostalgic too when they were young and they didn't have families and kids, and like, yeah, if I could turn back time, I would go there, I would go there, I would be like fighting for my right to party, burning down the house, all kinds of stuff.
Even though we know, you know, that kids don't have it that easy. I mean, of course, our kids have it easier, I guess. We talked
Because
about
we're
it.
awesome parents.
Yeah.
Why don't you two cut the horse shit and get to the part where you admit your sexual feelings for one another?
Whoa! We are big!
But, I mean, kids, you know, they have their own obligations, they have their own fears. I mean, kids have many fears and many concerns and anxieties, just like adults. And
sometimes even more, fear of the dark, of all kinds of stuff.
yeah, exactly. You feel really helpless in the world. Everyone tells you what to do. You're not autonomous. It can be, you know, really difficult. So basically, any time when we look back at it has both ends, right? It's never either or.
Yeah, everybody's looking for something. Like, we shouldn't mock their pain.
We shouldn't mock their pain, and we shouldn't say, okay, when I was a kid, everything was easy, because it probably wasn't.
We were happy in those days, although we were poor.
Because we were poor.
Aye.
I was happier then and I had nothing. We used to live in this tiny old tumble-down house with great big holes in the roof.
House? You were lucky to live in a house. We used to have to live in the corridor.
Oh, we used to dream of living in a corridor.
There were 150 of us living in a shoebox in the middle of the road.
Cardboard box?
Aye.
You were lucky.
We lived for 3 months in a rolled up newspaper in a septic tank.
But I think that most people are nostalgic to a different phase in their life. So let's say your kids are grown, you are nostalgic to the time when they were younger. When you have kids and they are small, you're like nostalgic to a time when you didn't have kids and you could just go out every single day. College, maybe you're nostalgic to the simple days of the high school. You're out of college, you're nostalgic. So it's just like when you change phases in your life, you start to look at the previous phase, like a more rosy glow.
Yeah.
I had to get up in the morning at 10 o'clock at night, half an hour before I went to bed, eat a lump of cold poison, work 29 hours a day down mill and pay mill owner for permission to come to work, and when we got home, our dad would kill us and dance about in our grave.
And I think the reason that now nostalgia is more prevalent than in the past is because we have all this library of the past 70 years of culture, music, clothes, architecture, food, whatever it is, and you can go back and just see all the different types of cultures that were at specific times, and everything changes also more quickly. So you can go back and take this music and these clothes and that architecture. You can create new stuff. Such a big difference that back in the day. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Wax on and wax off.
Yeah, very smooth.
We also had a Stranger Things podcast conversation with Rutger, so check out the link below, and thank you patrons for supporting the channel, and thank you Noga, boom, and we'll see you all next time. Bye everybody.